Ever seen a grown woman completely lose her mind in under 5 seconds? I'm talking full meltdown, screaming, crying, pointing fingers, the whole 9 yards. Well, let me paint you a picture. Tracy Milburn, my 37-year-old neighbor, going from arrest him right now to standing frozen like a deer in headlights, mouth hanging open when she saw who stepped out of that police car. The look on her face, priceless, pure, unfiltered panic. But here's the thing. This whole crazy story started 6 months ago with one simple decision I made. A decision that should have been no big deal, but apparently it drove Tracy absolutely bonkers. My name's Walter Briggs, but everyone calls me Walt. I'm 48 years old, a mechanical engineer who retired early after saving up enough to live comfortably. I've been living in Sunset Hills community for 8 years now, in a nice 3-bedroom house that I bought and paid off completely. No mortgage, no debt. Just me and my quiet little slice of suburbia in Nevada. The neighborhood's pretty typical. Middle-class families, well-maintained lawns, and unfortunately, a homeowners association that charges $320 every month for services I never used. The HOA fee covered things like a community pool that I never swam in, landscaping services for common areas I never visited, and monthly community events that felt more like forced social gatherings. After 8 years of paying these fees for services I didn't want or need, I finally decided enough was enough. The process of leaving the HOA was surprisingly simple. I looked up the state laws, filed the proper paperwork, and within 30 days, I was officially out. No more monthly fees, no more community rules, no more having to ask permission to plant flowers in my own yard. I thought it would be smooth sailing from there. I thought I could finally enjoy my retirement in peace, maybe do some consulting work on the side, and live life on my own terms. What I didn't expect was Tracy Milburn. Tracy lived 3 houses down from me with her husband Harold, who happened to be the current HOA president. She was one of those people who seemed to live for drama, always walking around the neighborhood with a clipboard and her phone camera ready to document any perceived violations. I'd seen her in action before, measuring the height of people's grass, taking pictures of cars parked slightly crooked, leaving passive-aggressive notes about holiday decorations being up too long, but I'd never been on her radar until I left the HOA. The first sign of trouble came just 2 days after my HOA withdrawal became official. I was out front watering my plants when Tracy marched up my driveway with a stack of papers in her hand. She was wearing her usual uniform, faded leggings, an oversized t-shirt, and flip-flops that had seen better days. Her blonde bob was clearly a home dye job, and she had that look in her eyes that I'd come to recognize as the "I'm about to ruin your day" express. "You can't just leave," she announced without any greeting or pleasantries. "That's not how neighborhoods work." I turned off my hose and gave her my full attention, thinking maybe there was some misunderstanding I could clear up. "Actually, Tracy, I can leave. I own my house outright, and state law allows property owners to withdraw from HOAs under certain circumstances." She waved her papers at me like they were some kind of legal weapon. But what about standards? What about property values? The way she emphasized those words made it clear this wasn't really about community standards at all. That's when I started to understand what was really going on. Tracy kept mentioning property values and resale prices, and I remembered Harold mentioning at a neighborhood barbecue last year that they were struggling financially. It became clear that Tracy wasn't worried about community standards. She was worried about money. Maybe they were planning to sell their house, or maybe they had other financial motivations I wasn't aware of. But whatever the reason, my decision to leave the HOA had triggered something in Tracy that went way beyond neighborhood politics. She pulled out a thick folder and started flipping through pages of printed photos and handwritten notes. "I've been documenting violations for months," she declared, showing me pictures of my house from various angles. There were photos of my lawn, mowed in diagonal patterns instead of horizontal lines, pictures of my car parked 6 inches off-center in my garage, and even a photo of my Christmas lights, still up on January 2nd instead of January 1st. I tried to remain calm and reasonable. "Tracy, these seem pretty minor, and besides, I'm not part of the HOA anymore, so these rules don't apply to me." Her voice started rising immediately. "They apply to everyone who wants to be a good neighbor. You can't just opt out of being part of a community." I could see this conversation wasn't going to end well, so I tried a different approach. "Look, Tracy, I understand you care about the neighborhood, but I just want to live peacefully in my own home. I'm not hurting anyone, and I'm still going to maintain my property. I just don't want to pay for services I don't use." But she was already shaking her head before I finished speaking. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about you. This affects all of us. When one person stops following the rules, it sets a precedent. Soon everyone will think they can just do whatever they want. I realized then that Tracy saw my HOA withdrawal as a personal challenge to her authority, even though she had no official position in the HOA hierarchy. As I watched Tracy march back to her house, clutching that folder like it was evidence in a murder trial, I felt a growing sense of unease. I thought explaining the law would end it. I thought one reasonable conversation would make her understand. But something about the way she'd looked at me, the intensity in her voice when she talked about property values, told me this was far from over. Tracy Milburn wasn't just upset about HOA rules. She was personally invested in controlling what happened in this neighborhood, and my decision to leave had thrown a wrench into whatever plans she had. I had no idea how far she was willing to go to maintain that control, but I was about to find out. This wasn't about community standards or neighborhood harmony. This was personal, and Tracy Milburn was just getting started. The harassment started immediately, but it wasn't subtle neighborhood drama. Tracy went completely off the rails. The very next morning I woke up to find her standing in my driveway with what looked like a construction measuring tape, actually measuring the distance from my garbage can to the curb. When she saw me watching from the window, she didn't even have the decency to look embarrassed. Instead, she pulled out a clipboard and started writing notes, like she was conducting some kind of official inspection. But here's where it got really weird. She'd brought a small portable speaker with her, and she was actually reading what sounded like fake HOA regulations out loud. Section 15.3 states that refuse containers must be placed exactly 18 inches from the curb, she announced in this ridiculous authoritative voice, loud enough for the entire neighborhood to hear. I decided right then that I needed security cameras, so I ordered a basic system online and had it installed within 2 days. Those cameras caught some absolutely unhinged behavior that I never would have believed without video evidence. The most disturbing incident happened on a Thursday morning when my doorbell camera captured Tracy wearing an official-looking vest with City Inspector written on it in what was clearly homemade lettering. She was walking around my property with a clipboard, taking pictures and measurements, then going door to door telling neighbors she was investigating complaints about the Briggs property. I could see my neighbor across the street, Carl, watching her through his blinds. He didn't say anything that day, but the look on his face said it all. Even he knew she'd crossed a line. A few kids on bikes paused to stare before speeding off like they'd witnessed something both hilarious and vaguely terrifying. My neighbor Ruth Danner later told me that Tracy had claimed there were serious safety violations that required immediate attention, but when Ruth asked to see her credentials, Tracy got flustered and left quickly. When I confronted Tracy about the fake inspector vest, her response was unlike anything I'd expected from a suburban neighbor dispute. I was just informing the community about potential safety issues, she said, but her voice had this manic edge to it that made me realize she was either completely delusional or deliberately trying to cause maximum chaos. Tracy, impersonating a government official is a federal crime, I told her calmly, and I have you on camera doing exactly that. Instead of backing down or apologizing, she doubled down. You can't prove anything, and your surveillance of me is the real crime here. She was practically shouting now, loud enough that other neighbors were coming outside to see what was happening. I know my rights, I know the law, but the wild look in her eyes suggested she was making up her legal knowledge as she went along. The situation escalated beyond anything I could have imagined when Tracy started targeting my basic utilities. I came home from a consulting appointment to find my house completely dark, no electricity, no internet, no air conditioning in the middle of summer. When I called the electric company, they told me that Mrs. Briggs had called earlier to report that the family had moved out and requested immediate service disconnection. It took me hours on the phone with customer service, a trip to their office with my driver's license, and a supervisor override to get my power restored. But Tracy wasn't done. Over the next week, she called my gas company, internet provider, and even tried to have my mail forwarded to a different address. Each time I had to prove my identity and convince various customer service representatives that I was the victim of some kind of elaborate prank. My neighbor Ruth Danner was the one who finally helped me understand the full scope of what Tracy was doing. Ruth was a retired nurse who'd lived in the neighborhood for 15 years, and she'd apparently been watching Tracy's behavior with growing concern. "Honey, what she's doing to you isn't normal neighborhood drama," Ruth told me over coffee one afternoon. "This is systematic harassment, and it's not the first time she's done it." Ruth went on to explain that Tracy had targeted the Johnson family back in 2019 with similar tactics. They had twin babies and fell behind on HOA fees because of medical bills, Ruth said quietly. Tracy made their life such hell that they ended up selling their house and moving away just to escape her. The revelation that Tracy had successfully driven away previous neighbors made me realize this wasn't just about me. This was Tracy's established pattern for dealing with anyone who challenged her authority. That night, I sat in my kitchen looking at all the documentation I'd been collecting, fake inspector photos, utility disconnection records, Ruth's testimony about the Johnson family, and I realized that Tracy wasn't going to stop until one of us was gone from this neighborhood. But I also realized something else. Tracy had been getting away with this behavior because her previous victims had chosen to leave rather than fight back. The Johnsons had probably figured it was easier to sell their house than to deal with a deranged neighbor, but I wasn't the Johnsons. I owned my house outright. I had no intention of moving, and I was starting to get really angry about being pushed around by someone who had no legal authority over me whatsoever. Tracy Milburn had picked the wrong target this time, and she was about to find out what happened when someone decided to fight back instead of running away. The next morning, I called Harold directly to ask about Tracy's latest official document, another fake violation notice that had appeared in my mailbox overnight. Harold Milburn sounded exhausted and embarrassed when he heard my voice. "Walt, I never sent you any violation notice," he said quietly. "You're not part of the HOA anymore, so we have no authority over your property anyway." I could hear the strain in his voice as he continued. "Someone forged my signature on that document, and we both know who it was." The admission that his own wife was forging his signature on fake legal documents seemed to break something in Harold. "I don't know how to stop her," he confessed. "She's convinced that you're some kind of threat to the entire neighborhood." That afternoon, I decided to test Tracy's real motivations with a brilliant little trap. I went to the hardware store, bought a professional house for sale sign, and planted it prominently in my front yard. I wasn't actually planning to sell, this was pure strategy. If Tracy was genuinely concerned about community standards, she should be happy to see a problematic neighbor preparing to leave. But if she had other motives, her reaction would tell me everything I needed to know. I also set up a voice recording app on my phone, because I had a strong suspicion Tracy would be calling very soon. Sure enough, my phone rang less than 2 hours after I put up the sign. The caller ID showed an unknown number, but the voice was unmistakably Tracy's, though she was trying to disguise it with this ridiculous, fake sweet tone. "Hi there, I saw your for sale sign, and I'm very interested in your property," she said, sounding like a bad actress reading from a script. I decided to have some fun with this. "Well, it's available, but I should probably warn you about some serious neighborhood issues," I replied. "There's this neighbor who's been harassing me for months. Very unstable person, always taking pictures, filing false reports, impersonating government officials. It's been a real nightmare." There was a moment of silence before Tracy's fake voice cracked slightly. "Which neighbor? What kind of harassment?" she asked, clearly fishing for details about her own behavior. Here's where my trap got really interesting. Instead of hanging up, I decided to call her bluff in real time. "You know what? Let me call you back in 5 minutes with more details," I said. "What's your name and number?" Tracy gave me an obviously fake name, but her real phone number, probably forgetting that caller ID exists. As soon as I hung up, I immediately called the number back. Through my security camera, I could see Tracy standing right outside my front gate, still wearing that ridiculous fake inspector vest, answering her phone. When she heard my voice, saying, "Hi, this is Walt Briggs returning your call about my house," the look of panic that crossed her face was absolutely priceless. She actually dropped her phone and tried to run away, but I was already walking outside to confront her. "Tracy," I called out calmly, "we need to talk." She stopped running and turned around, her face bright red with embarrassment and rage. "You tricked me," she shouted, as if I was the one doing something wrong. "That was entrapment." I couldn't help but laugh at her legal analysis. "Tracy, you called me pretending to be a potential buyer while standing outside my house in a fake government vest. I think you've got bigger problems than worrying about entrapment." That's when she completely lost what remained of her composure. "You think you're so smart," she screamed, "but I know what you're really doing. You're trying to destroy our property values on purpose. You're trying to ruin this neighborhood." The confrontation attracted several other neighbors, who came outside to see what the commotion was about. Ruth Danner was the first to approach, and when she saw Tracy in the fake inspector vest, her expression shifted from curiosity to disgust. "Tracy Milburn? What in the world are you doing?" Ruth asked, in the kind of voice that suggested she already knew the answer wouldn't be good. Carl Reed, who lived across the street, admitted that he'd received a similar fake inspection visit and had been confused by Tracy's suspicious behavior and obvious fake credentials. "I thought something was off," he said, looking embarrassed, "but I didn't want to cause trouble by questioning her." That evening, I organized all my evidence and created a public display that would expose Tracy's harassment campaign to the entire neighborhood. I printed out copies of all the fake documents she'd sent, the security camera screenshots of her trespassing and impersonating officials, and even a transcript of her fake buyer phone call. I laminated everything and posted it on my front gate with a large sign that read, "Warning, fake inspector and forged documents protect your family." Within hours, neighbors were stopping by to read the display, and the community group chat was buzzing with people sharing their own stories of suspicious interactions with Tracy. But Tracy wasn't ready to admit defeat. Instead of backing down, she decided to escalate to her final desperate strategy. The next day, I received an invitation to what Tracy called an emergency neighborhood safety meeting at her house. The agenda was simple: addressing the Walter Briggs situation and protecting our community. She'd invited select neighbors while specifically excluding Ruth and anyone else who'd shown support for me. It was clear that Tracy was making one last attempt to turn the entire neighborhood against me, but I had something she didn't have: the truth, backed up by solid evidence and witnesses. As I prepared for what felt like the final battle in this absurd war, I realized that Tracy had made one critical miscalculation. She thought this was still about HOA rules and neighborhood politics, but this had become something much bigger. This was about whether a community would stand up to a bully or let her continue terrorizing innocent people. Thursday evening felt like high noon in an old Western movie as I walked toward Tracy's house carrying my folder of evidence. She'd transformed her living room into something resembling a courtroom, complete with a poster board titled "Evidence Against Walter Briggs" in dramatic red letters. About 8 neighbors sat uncomfortably on folding chairs while Tracy paced back and forth like a prosecutor preparing for the trial of the century. Harold sat in the corner looking like he wanted to disappear into the wallpaper, and when Ruth and I walked in together, the room fell silent with tension you could cut with a knife. "I didn't invite you," Tracy announced immediately, pointing at me like I was some kind of criminal intruder. "This meeting is about you, not for you." I remained calm and respectful, despite Tracy's hostile reception. "If you're going to discuss me and my property in a community meeting, I have the right to defend myself," I said reasonably. "I'm sure everyone would prefer to hear both sides before making any judgments." Ruth immediately backed me up with her characteristic no-nonsense approach. "That's only fair, Tracy. If you're making accusations, Walt should be able to respond to them." A ripple of murmurs spread across the room, some surprised, others relieved. I could tell many of them had questions too, but hadn't dared to ask. This was no longer just about me and Tracy. The entire neighborhood was quietly reevaluating everything they'd seen but never spoken aloud. Several neighbors nodded in agreement, which clearly wasn't part of Tracy's master plan. She looked frustrated but couldn't refuse without appearing completely unreasonable, so she gestured grudgingly for us to sit down while muttering something about disruptive behavior. Tracy launched into her presentation with the dramatic flair of a daytime television lawyer. "Walter Briggs has become a clear and present danger to our community," she began, gesturing toward her poster board like she was revealing evidence in a murder case. "He refuses to follow basic community standards. He harasses innocent neighbors with surveillance equipment, and he's deliberately attempting to damage our property values through his reckless behavior." She displayed her carefully selected photos, which had obviously been chosen and possibly edited to make my property look as problematic as possible. "He posts defamatory materials about respected community members, he records private conversations without consent, and he's created an atmosphere of fear and intimidation that threatens the safety of our families." When Tracy finished her theatrical presentation and looked around the room expectantly, she was met with uncomfortable silence, instead of the enthusiastic support she'd obviously anticipated. That's when I calmly placed a small digital recorder on the coffee table and opened my organized folder of actual evidence. "Before anyone makes decisions based on what Tracy just presented," I said in a measured tone, "I think you should see the complete timeline of what's really been happening here." I began methodically laying out the real story, starting with Tracy's immediate hostile reaction to my legal withdrawal from the HOA and progressing through each escalation of her increasingly unhinged harassment campaign. The mood in the room shifted dramatically as I presented the security camera footage of Tracy impersonating a government official, the audio recording of her pretending to be a house buyer, and the fake documents with Harold's forged signature. Carl Reed, who had been wavering between sides throughout this ordeal, looked genuinely shocked as the scope of Tracy's deception became clear. "Tracy, did you really forge Harold's signature on official-looking document?" he asked directly. Tracy's carefully constructed composure began cracking under the weight of undeniable evidence. "I don't care about your so-called proof," she shouted, her voice rising to a pitch that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. The police will believe me when I call them. You think you're so clever with your recordings and fake evidence, but law enforcement will see right through your manipulation. The way Tracy said, "when I call them," made it obvious that she was already planning to involve the police, which honestly surprised me given all the evidence of her own illegal behavior. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of feeling worried about her threat, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. "Tracy," I said with a slight smile that seemed to confuse everyone in the room, "if you want to call the police, please go ahead. I'll wait right here for them." The confidence in my voice was so genuine that even Ruth gave me a curious look, clearly wondering what I knew that nobody else did. Tracy stared at me with obvious confusion. "You actually want me to call the police?" she asked, her voice betraying uncertainty for the first time all evening. Something about my calm acceptance of police involvement seemed to infuriate Tracy beyond her breaking point. She pulled out her cell phone and dialed 911 with the kind of theatrical flourish that suggested she thought this was her moment of ultimate triumph. "Yes, I need police immediately at 1520 Maple Drive for a dangerous neighbor who's been threatening me and terrorizing our entire community," she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. The dispatcher asked for more details, and Tracy launched into an increasingly hysterical description of how I'd been psychologically abusing her and creating a climate of fear in the neighborhood. After she hung up, she looked around the room with obvious satisfaction. "There, now we'll see who the police believe when they hear the truth." As we waited for the police to arrive, the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a chainsaw. Ruth whispered, "Walt, what's your plan here?" But I just smiled mysteriously and said, "Trust me, everything's gonna work out exactly as it should." My confidence seemed to puzzle everyone present, including Tracy, who was pacing back and forth like a caged animal, while occasionally muttering about justice finally being served. Carl Reed looked nervous about the police involvement. Harold appeared to be questioning every life choice that had led him to this moment, and the other neighbors seemed torn between wanting to leave and wanting to see how this drama would finally resolve itself. When we heard the police sirens approaching in the distance, Tracy practically vibrated with excitement. "Finally," she kept repeating, "finally, he'll get what he deserves. Everyone's going to see that I was right about him all along." But I just sat there peacefully, occasionally checking my watch and organizing my evidence folder one more time. As the sirens grew louder, I couldn't help but think about how Tracy had no idea that her moment of anticipated triumph was about to become the most devastating defeat of her entire life. I was going to show everyone in this room exactly who my backup really was. The police sirens grew louder as they approached our quiet suburban street, and Tracy was in full celebration mode before the officer had even arrived. She was fixing her hair, practicing her victim voice, and clearly preparing for what she believed would be my public arrest and humiliation in front of all our neighbors. "Officer, thank God you're here," she whispered to herself, rehearsing her opening lines like an actress preparing for the performance of her lifetime. Meanwhile, I remained seated calmly, almost zen-like in my composure, which seemed to genuinely confuse several neighbors who expected me to be more concerned about impending police involvement. When the patrol car finally pulled up, Tracy immediately rushed toward it like she was greeting a celebrity arriving at a red carpet event. "Officer, over here! I'm Tracy Milburn, the one who called," she shouted, waving her arms dramatically before the officer had even stepped out of the vehicle. "Thank you so much for coming. This man has been terrorizing our peaceful neighborhood for months." She pointed at me accusingly while I remained seated on her porch, making no effort to interrupt her increasingly frantic performance. "He threatens me. He stalks me with cameras, he puts up defamatory signs, and he completely refuses to follow basic community standards. I demand you arrest him immediately." The officer stepped out of his patrol car and immediately took control of the situation, with the kind of professional authority that comes from years of dealing with neighborhood disputes. "Ma'am, I need you to calm down and let me assess what's happening here," he said firmly. "Please step back and allow me to speak with both parties involved." But Tracy was far too excited to listen to reasonable instructions from law enforcement. "Both parties? He's the criminal here," she protested loudly. "There's only one side to this story, and it's my side. I have documentation, I have witnesses, I have proof of everything he's done to destroy our community." I finally stood up and walked calmly toward the officer, extending my hand in a respectful greeting. "Good evening, officer. I'm Walter Briggs, and I appreciate you responding to this call." I pulled out my phone and held it up clearly. "I've been recording this interaction for everyone's protection, and I have organized documentation related to this dispute if you'd like to review it." Tracy immediately erupted with vindication. "See? He's obsessed with recording people. That's part of his systematic harassment pattern." But the officer seemed more impressed by my calm, respectful demeanor than concerned about my transparency in documenting the encounter. Ruth moved closer to me and whispered, "Walt, you seem remarkably calm for someone who's about to be arrested." I looked at her with complete confidence and replied, "Sometimes the best strategy is letting your opponent overplay their hand. Plus, I have complete faith in our local law enforcement's ability to recognize the truth." There was something in my tone that made Ruth study my face more carefully, like she was trying to figure out what I knew that everyone else didn't. "You sound like you actually want her to call the police," she observed quietly. "Let's just say I believe justice has a way of showing up when you need it most," I replied, checking my watch again with obvious anticipation. Tracy was becoming increasingly manic as she realized the officer wasn't immediately handcuffing me and dragging me away. "Why aren't you arresting him?" she demanded frantically. "I called you. I'm the victim here. He's been harassing me for months." Her voice was getting higher and more shrill with each protest, and I could see neighbors starting to record her breakdown with their phones. "I have evidence. I have documentation. Why won't you believe me?" The officer maintained his professional composure despite Tracy's increasingly unhinged behavior. "Ma'am, I'm conducting a thorough investigation of all allegations. Please allow me to do my job properly." As the officer reviewed my organized folder of evidence and Tracy's increasingly desperate collection of trivial complaints, I noticed something that made me smile slightly. The way he carried himself, his professional demeanor, even some of his mannerisms reminded me of someone very important in my life. Tracy was still protesting loudly about why I wasn't in handcuffs when the officer looked up from his paperwork and made direct eye contact with me. That's when I knew for certain that Tracy's moment of triumph was about to become her absolute worst nightmare. The officer finished his preliminary investigation and walked back toward his patrol car to retrieve additional paperwork, and Tracy was practically bouncing with anticipation. "This is it," she whispered excitedly to Harold, who was standing nearby looking like he wanted to crawl under a rock and disappear forever. "He's getting the arrest forms. I told you the police would see right through Walt's manipulation." She turned to address the crowd of neighbors who had gathered to witness this unprecedented drama. "Everyone's about to see what happens when you cross the wrong person. Justice is finally being served." Her confidence was at its absolute peak as she prepared for what she believed would be my complete public humiliation and removal from the neighborhood. I remained standing calmly near my evidence folder, watching as the officer approached his vehicle with the kind of professional composure that filled me with deep pride and confidence. Tracy was so focused on her anticipated victory that she completely missed the subtle smile that crossed my face as I watched him return with his clipboard. "Hope you enjoyed living here, Walt," Tracy called out to me mockingly, "because you're about to be gone." I just nodded calmly and replied, "You're absolutely right, Tracy. Actions definitely have consequences, and tonight, everyone's going to see exactly what those consequences look like." The officer walked back toward our group, removing his sunglasses as he approached in the fading evening light. Tracy was practically vibrating with excitement, still convinced that this was her moment of ultimate vindication. "Officer," she called out eagerly, "are you ready to arrest him now? I can provide additional evidence if you need it." But the officer wasn't looking at Tracy anymore. Instead, he was looking directly at me with an expression that seemed both completely professional and oddly personal at the same time. That's when I decided it was time to end this charade once and for all. "Hey son," I said with the biggest smile of my entire life, "how was your shift?" The words seemed to hang in the air for exactly 2 seconds before their meaning hit everyone present like a lightning bolt. Officer Joel Briggs, 25 years old and my absolute pride and joy, grinned back at me and replied, "Pretty quiet until now, Dad." The silence that followed was so complete and profound that you could have heard a pin drop from 3 houses away. Every single person in that crowd, Tracy, Harold, Carl, Ruth, and all the other neighbors, stood frozen in absolute stunned disbelief as the implications of what they'd just witnessed sank in completely. Tracy's transformation was absolutely spectacular to witness. The color drained from her face so quickly that for a moment I was genuinely concerned she might actually faint right there on the sidewalk. Her mouth fell open in a perfect circle of shock and horror, and her phone slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering onto the pavement with a sharp crack that echoed in the stunned silence. "No," she whispered, shaking her head slowly like she was trying to wake up from a nightmare. "No, no, no. This can't be happening." She started backing away from Joel as if he were some kind of supernatural apparition. "This is a setup? This is corruption," she screamed, her voice breaking with panic and complete disbelief. The absolute meltdown that followed was everything this story's title had promised and more. Tracy began pointing wildly at both Joel and me, her hair becoming increasingly disheveled as she gestured frantically, like a person possessed. "You planned this! You both planned this from the beginning," she shrieked at the top of her lungs. "This is police corruption. This is conspiracy. This isn't fair." In her panic and rage, she stepped backward too quickly and tripped spectacularly over her own garden hose, stumbling and nearly falling before Harold rushed over to steady her. The crowd of neighbors who had been recording everything with their phones captured every single moment of her complete breakdown. Joel maintained his absolute professionalism despite the personal connection and Tracy's increasingly unhinged accusations of corruption and conspiracy. "Ma'am, I need you to calm down so I can properly complete my investigation," he said in the same authoritative tone he'd maintained throughout the entire encounter. "I understand you called about a neighbor dispute, and I've reviewed all the evidence provided by both parties." Tracy was having absolutely none of his professional approach. "You can't investigate your own father. This is the most corrupt thing I've ever seen in my entire life. I demand a different officer. I demand your supervisor. I'm calling the FBI." Her voice had reached a pitch that was genuinely painful to listen to. The crowd's reaction was a perfect mixture of amazement, entertainment, and the satisfaction of seeing justice finally being served after months of watching Tracy terrorize an innocent neighbor. Ruth was trying not to laugh out loud as she whispered to Carl Reed, "Well, this certainly explains why Walt was so calm about having the police call." Carl, who had spent weeks being manipulated by Tracy's lies about my character and intentions, looked absolutely stunned as the full scope of the situation became crystal clear. "Tracy," he said quietly, his voice filled with dawning realization, "did you really make all of this up? All those complaints and accusations about Walt?" The weight of his question seemed to hang in the air as other neighbors began pulling out their phones to record Tracy's spectacular public meltdown. The aftermath of Tracy's arrest was swift, comprehensive, and absolutely devastating to her reputation. Within just a few hours of Joel placing her in handcuffs for filing false police reports and impersonating a government official, video footage of her complete breakdown had spread throughout every neighborhood social media group, community chat thread, and local drama forum in the entire county. The image of Tracy screaming about police corruption while being arrested by my son became an instant classic in HOA drama circles, with hundreds of people sharing their own stories about dealing with neighborhood bullies and expressing deep satisfaction that this particular Karen had finally received her well-deserved comeuppance. Harold resigned as HOA president the very next morning, submitting a brief letter citing personal family issues that require my immediate and undivided attention. In reality, he was probably just completely mortified that his wife's criminal behavior had become public knowledge and would forever be associated with his leadership of the community organization. Carl Reed, who had spent weeks being manipulated by Tracy's lies about my character and motivations, posted a public apology in the neighborhood group chat that was both heartfelt and embarrassing. "I owe Walt Briggs a sincere and heartfelt apology," he wrote. "I allowed myself to be influenced by someone else's personal vendetta, instead of making my own judgment about his character. Walt is a genuinely good neighbor who deserved much better treatment from all of us, and I'm ashamed that I didn't speak up sooner." Ruth Danner was elected as emergency interim HOA president by unanimous vote at a hastily organized community meeting, and one of her first official acts was establishing comprehensive new policies specifically designed to prevent the kind of harassment and abuse of authority that Tracy had perpetrated against me and apparently other residents in the past. The new neighbor mediation process required any complaints to be submitted in writing with actual evidence, prohibited individuals from taking any enforcement actions on behalf of the HOA without proper authorization, and created a formal appeals process for residents who felt they were being unfairly targeted by overzealous neighbors. "We're going to run this community based on mutual respect and actual rules," Ruth announced to enthusiastic applause, "not personal vendettas and completely made-up violations." The truth about Tracy's real motivations finally came out when Harold, broken by the shame and legal complications of his wife's criminal actions, confessed everything to me during a private conversation that was both awkward and enlightening. "She was completely obsessed with property values because we're in serious financial trouble," he admitted, looking like a man who had aged 10 years in the past week alone. "We took out a second mortgage 3 years ago to cover some bad investments, and we've been struggling to make the payments ever since." Tracy had convinced herself that if you moved away voluntarily or were forced out, her brother could buy your house for well below market value and flip it for a profit. that would help us avoid foreclosure. The revelation that all of Tracy's harassment had been motivated by a desperate and illegal get-rich-quick scheme involving my property made her behavior even more despicable than I had originally thought. Harold also revealed that Tracy had attempted similar harassment campaigns against other neighbors in the past, always with the ultimate goal of pressuring people to sell their homes so her family could somehow benefit financially from the transactions. She did it to the Johnsons. They had twin babies and medical bills, he said, with genuine remorse in his voice. She made their life such hell that they sold their house and moved away just to escape her constant harassment. I should have stopped her years ago, but I was scared of standing up to her, and I convinced myself that maybe she really was protecting community standards. He filed for divorce within 2 weeks of Tracy's arrest and moved in with his brother while he tried to rebuild his life and reputation. I enabled her behavior for far too long by signing whatever papers she put in front of me, he told me. I am deeply sorry to everyone she hurt, especially you. 6 months after Tracy's arrest and departure from our neighborhood, I hosted the first annual Sunset Hills Community BBQ in my backyard, and it was an absolutely wonderful celebration of how much our community had improved. Joel attended in civilian clothes, and I proudly introduced him to neighbors who hadn't known about our relationship during the dramatic events of that evening. The party was a huge success, with nearly every family in the neighborhood contributing food, games, and genuinely positive energy that had been missing during Tracy's reign of terror. Property values in our community actually increased by 8% over the following year, as word spread that we'd eliminated our problem resident and established a much healthier community culture based on mutual respect rather than fear and intimidation. The final piece of poetic justice came when Ruth received a phone call from a friend who lived in Tracy's new community, about 200 miles away. "There's this woman here who's already causing major problems with our HOA," her friend reported with obvious frustration. "She's filing complaints about everyone, trying to organize people against certain residents, and claiming she has extensive experience dealing with problem neighbors from her previous community. Does the name Tracy Milburn mean anything to you?" Ruth and I just looked at each other and started laughing. "Some people never learn," I said, shaking my head in amazement. "But that's definitely not our problem anymore. I just hope they figure her out a lot faster than we did." Looking back on this entire experience, I realized that Tracy's harassment campaign taught me something valuable about standing up to bullies, trusting in justice, and having faith that truth will eventually prevail over lies and manipulation. They say what goes around comes around, but sometimes karma needs a little help from good documentation, patient persistence, and occasionally a son who happens to wear a police uniform. 6 months later, our neighborhood is everything I hoped it would be when I first moved here. Peaceful, friendly, and completely free of the drama and fear that Tracy had created. She learned the hard way that you can't bully innocent people indefinitely without eventually facing serious consequences for your actions. And if you're dealing with your own HOA Karen right now, remember this story. Document everything carefully, stay calm under pressure, trust the legal process, and have faith that justice has a way of showing up in uniform when you need it most. Sometimes the best revenge really is just letting people destroy themselves with their own terrible behavior.